It sounds like a tiny rule change. A 3-minute pause. A water break. Something so harmless, so reasonable, so easy to defend that arguing against it almost makes you sound ridiculous. And yet somehow this one decision has managed to drag the World Cup into one of the strangest fights football has seen in years, because the deeper you look at it, the less it feels like a medical precaution, and the more it feels like a test of who controls the rhythm of the sport, who gets to reshape the tournament, and whether the biggest event in football is quietly being rebuilt in front of everyone while pretending nothing important has changed. Because this is not just about players drinking water, this is about FIFA turning the World Cup into something it has never really been before. It is about a sport built on uninterrupted flow suddenly being cut into scheduled chunks. It is about coaches finding an advantage they were never supposed to have. It is about fans watching momentum disappear in real time. It is about broadcasters discovering fresh space to sell one of the most expensive things in television, guaranteed attention during a World Cup match. And the most uncomfortable part is that every side of this argument has just enough truth to make the whole thing harder to see. On the surface, the change sounds simple. Instead of water breaks happening only when referees feel conditions are dangerous enough, the World Cup now has mandatory 3-minute hydration breaks built into the game. Not maybe, not if the referee thinks it is necessary. Mandatory, scheduled, locked in. One around the 22nd minute, another around the 67th. 2 stoppages that effectively carve a football match into quarters, or at least something uncomfortably close to it. And that is where the argument begins, because football has always had pauses, but not like this. Not guaranteed, not scripted, not sitting on the calendar of the match before the ball is even kicked. And FIFA has a very clean explanation for why it is happening. Player welfare. Extreme heat, a sport pushing athletes through hotter summers, heavier calendars, more congested tournaments, and conditions that are becoming harder to ignore. On paper, it is almost impossible to attack that argument without sounding reckless. We are talking about dehydration, heat stress, fatigue, collapse risk. We are talking about a tournament that increasingly travels through climates where just play through it stops sounding brave and starts sounding negligent. So if FIFA says these breaks are there to protect players, that should be the end of the story. Except it is not, because once doctors and climate experts enter the conversation, the story gets stranger, not cleaner. A lot of the medical voices do not reject the breaks at all. In fact, some of them say the opposite. They say breaks like this are not some overreaction. They are becoming necessary. That is the first twist. The people who know the most about heat stress are not laughing at the policy. They are warning that football may actually need more protection in the future, not less. They point to the obvious trend line: hotter tournaments, hotter summers, more strain on players, and a sport that still loves pretending the environment around it is a minor detail instead of a competitive hazard. So now the anti-break argument already has a problem. If the medical side says this is serious, then the breaks cannot just be dismissed as a gimmick. But the pro-break argument has a problem too, because the same experts who support player protection also expose the first major contradiction in FIFA's approach. If the point is medical necessity, then why are the breaks mandatory in conditions where they may not be medically necessary at all? Why force the same interruption in cool weather, in lower risk matches, in situations where players themselves do not feel the need for it? Why build a universal rule for a problem that is not universal in every game? That is where the players step in and the mood changes immediately. Because from the player side, this does not feel like a carefully calibrated medical intervention. It feels like interference. It feels like someone barging into the middle of a match and pressing pause whether the game wants it or not. And for players, rhythm is not some abstract romantic idea. Rhythm is the match. Rhythm is pressure building, tired defenders making mistakes, underdogs surviving a storm and suddenly believing they can do something bigger. Rhythm is also panic. If your team is being battered, the last thing the other side wants is a free reset. But if you are the one under pressure, a mandatory break can feel like a lifeline dropped from the sky. That is why so many of the player complaints land in the same place. Not because they are against water, not because they think heat safety is fake, but because they know what these stoppages do to a match once the ball starts moving and emotions take over. A football game is not a meeting. It is not supposed to stop because a clock says it is time for a procedural pause. Players talk about momentum because momentum decides games. It changes body language. It changes risk-taking. It changes who feels the stadium leaning behind them and who feels it turning hostile. Break that rhythm at the wrong moment, and you are not just giving players a drink, you are altering the emotional weather of the game. And then you get to the fan reaction, which is where the controversy really stops looking like a niche coaching debate and starts feeling like a legitimacy problem, because fans have been overwhelmingly skeptical of this. Not mildly irritated, not split down the middle, skeptical in the way supporters become skeptical when they sense the sport is being adjusted around them rather than for them. The complaint is not just that the pauses are boring, it is that they feel unnatural, they feel imported, they feel like football borrowing a format from sports with built-in commercial timeouts and trying to disguise it as care. That is a dangerous perception for FIFA to trigger, because once fans start believing the match itself is being rearranged for reasons that are not entirely sporting, every future change becomes harder to trust. And the examples are what make that suspicion stick. Take a game where one side is hanging on by their fingernails, the underdog is somehow still alive, the favorite is swarming, the crowd can feel something breaking, and then suddenly everything stops. Coaches gather players, instructions come out, legs recover, panic settles, the favorite reorganizes, the underdog loses the emotional wave that had been carrying them. It does not mean the break caused the result, that would be too simple, but it absolutely means the break changed the conditions of the fight. And once fans see that happen a few times, they stop viewing the stoppage as neutral. It starts to look like an intervention with consequences. That is what makes the "it's only 3 minutes" defense so weak. 3 minutes in football can be nothing, or it can be everything. It can be the exact amount of time a coach needs to kill a comeback, fix a defensive problem, slow down an opponent, calm a star player, or reorganize a press that was falling apart. Football has always had halftime for that. That was the point. 90 minutes split into two halves, with the chaos of the half protected from constant sideline control. The more these hydration breaks become routine tactical conferences, the more the sport drifts away from that design, and the coaches are the ones who accidentally say the quiet part out loud. Because if you ask managers what these breaks actually do, the answer is often brutally honest. Yes, players hydrate. Yes, they cool down. But the real value is obvious. They are tactical timeouts. They are mini halftimes dropped into the middle of the match. Free windows to coach, reset, adjust shape, switch pressing triggers, stop the emotional bleeding, or turn a bad spell into a new plan. In other words, they are not just health measures operating in the background of the game. They are active strategic tools, and coaches know it. That is where the entire debate starts to change shape. Because now we are no longer arguing about whether players should be allowed to drink water in extreme heat. That is not a debate. We are arguing about whether football's biggest tournament has quietly introduced a structural change that gives managers new control over matches while pretending the change is purely humanitarian. And if that sounds harsh, look at the incentives. Coaches benefit from it. Struggling teams benefit from it. Favorites under pressure benefit from it. Even players who dislike the interruption may still benefit from the recovery. Almost nobody involved has a reason to say this is warping the game, unless they are on the wrong side of a momentum swing. But even that is not the deepest layer, because the moment you accept that the breaks are changing tactics, the next question becomes unavoidable. If FIFA really wanted hydration without changing the structure of the game this dramatically, were there no other ways to do it? More flexible referee discretion, weather-triggered breaks only, cooling measures tailored to actual conditions, more aggressive pre-match protocols, different kickoff strategies, better tournament scheduling. There are options. Messy options maybe, imperfect options definitely, but options. So why settle on the one version that also happens to create guaranteed stoppages at predictable times in the most watched sporting event on earth? And that is when the money walks into the room, because a scheduled break in a World Cup match is not just a sporting event, it is inventory. It is premium, global, high-attention advertising inventory inserted into the most valuable live product in football. That is what makes this whole thing so explosive. A mandatory 3-minute pause is not just a pause. Multiply it across the tournament, and suddenly you are not looking at a few harmless water breaks. You are looking at hours of additional stoppage time that broadcasters can package, sell, and monetize. Not in theory, in practice, with brands, with rates. lights, with all the machinery that follows a guaranteed ad slot inside the biggest tournament on the planet. And this is where the official story gets very slippery very fast. Because if the breaks were purely about welfare, then what happens during those breaks should not matter that much to the business model, but it clearly does. Some broadcasters use them as clean ad windows, others do not. Some stay with the match, others cut away. And that difference matters because it exposes the lie hidden inside the phrase, the break has to happen. No, the break may happen. But what people do with that break is a choice. And when certain networks instantly treat it like a commercial jackpot, the suspicion around the policy stops sounding paranoid and starts sounding rational. That does not automatically prove FIFA invented the breaks for ad money. That is the strongest counter argument, and it matters. Heat is real, player safety is real, climate pressure is real. It would be lazy to pretend otherwise. It would also be lazy to act as if every welfare measure in modern sport is secretly a scam. Sometimes the boring explanation is the correct one. Sometimes athletes do need protection, and administrators do make the right call for the right reason. But here is the problem with that defense. Even if the original motive was sincere, the structure of the rule still creates a commercial and tactical opportunity so massive that it becomes impossible to separate the welfare argument from everything piggybacking on top of it. That is the trap FIFA has built for itself. Once you create mandatory pauses in the middle of a World Cup match, you are not just protecting players, you are redistributing control of the game. You are handing coaches 2 extra intervention points. You are handing broadcasters fresh monetizable space. You are handing fans a reason to suspect the sport's flow is being sold off in pieces. And you are doing all of it under the moral cover of player welfare, which makes criticism feel uncomfortable even when the criticism is valid. That is why the debate has become so effective at hiding itself. Everyone gets stuck arguing on the surface. Doctors talk about heat. Players talk about rhythm. Fans talk about boredom and fairness. Coaches talk about recovery and tactical adjustments. Broadcasters say nothing unless they have to. FIFA points to welfare and moves on. Every one of those conversations is real. Every one of them contains part of the truth. And because everyone is busy fighting over their own piece, the larger question keeps slipping away. What exactly has football just normalized? A World Cup match used to have a shape. 2 halves, 1 halftime, long stretches where the game belonged to the players on the field and not to planned interruptions. Now that shape looks less fixed than it used to, and that should worry people far beyond this specific rule, because once the tournament accepts scheduled mid-half stoppages as normal, the barrier has been broken. The sport has admitted that the flow of the match can be redesigned if the justification is strong enough, marketable enough, or useful enough. Today it is hydration, tomorrow it could be something else wrapped in equally careful language. And history says governing bodies rarely move backward once a structural change becomes profitable, convenient, or politically defensible. That is the part fans can feel, even if they cannot articulate it in policy terms. It is why the reaction is so instinctive. They are not just reacting to a drink's break, they are reacting to the sense that football is being nudged toward a version of itself that looks more manageable, more stoppage friendly, more sponsor friendly, more coach controlled, and less wild, less continuous, less alive. The kind of change that sounds small when announced and enormous once it becomes permanent. And FIFA has not really solved that trust problem. If anything, it has deepened it, because the organization can point to science, and the science is not fake. It can point to climate conditions, and the climate conditions are not fake. It can say it is acting responsibly, and maybe in part it is, but none of that answers the hardest questions. Why make the breaks universal instead of conditional? Why lock them into the match as a fixed feature? Why create a system that so obviously doubles as a tactical timeout and a commercial break? Why introduce a welfare policy that just happens to align so neatly with the interests of coaches and broadcasters at the same time? And once those questions are sitting there, trust starts to drain out of the room, because this is FIFA, not a governing body operating on unlimited goodwill, not an institution with a spotless record of putting the purity of the game ahead of money, optics, politics, and control. That context matters. It matters because every new policy arrives carrying the weight of old suspicion. Fans do not evaluate these decisions in a vacuum. They evaluate them through years of seeing football stretched, sold, expanded, repackaged, and defended with language that sounds noble right up until the money appears. That is why this debate refuses to die. Not because the breaks are the worst thing to happen to football. They are not. Not because hydration is controversial. It is is not. The reason it keeps growing is that it sits right on top of a fault line running through the modern game. Welfare versus spectacle, safety versus rhythm, sport versus television, necessary adaptation versus opportunistic redesign, and the World Cup, the one tournament that is supposed to feel untouchable, is now the place where all of those tensions are colliding at once. So yes, on one level, this is a fight about a 3-minute pause, but on another level, it is a fight about who football belongs to when the stakes are highest. The players trying to survive the heat, the coaches desperate for control, the fans paying to watch the game breathe on its own, the broadcasters turning every interruption into a business opportunity, or FIFA sitting above all of them, insisting that this is a simple health measure while the consequences spread far beyond health. And that is the real reason this debate has taken over the World Cup. Not because everyone suddenly cares about water breaks, but because a tiny pause exposed a much bigger fear that the future of football may not be changed by one giant scandal or one dramatic rule revolution. It may be changed by small, defensible adjustments that arrive one by one, each with a reasonable explanation, each impossible to oppose without sounding extreme, until one day the sport still looks like football from a distance, but feels completely different once the match begins. That is the danger here. Not the break itself, the precedent, because if a mandatory stoppage can be sold as welfare, used as tactics, monetized as inventory, defended as modernity, and normalized before fans have even agreed on what it is, then this is not the end of the argument, it is the beginning of a much bigger one.